Hi, I'm Richard O'Brien. I'm the Birmingham Poet Laureate 2018 to 2020, and in this video I'm going to read a few poems that came out of my time as Laureate and answer some questions put to me by Poetry on Loan, which is a great organisation that promotes reading, writing and engaging with poetry in community libraries, and I think really illustrates why they're such important spaces for lifelong learning across their local communities and why we really need to support these spaces. So I'm going to answer a few of these questions and intersperse them with some of my own work. So the first question, how did I get started with poetry? What inspired me to start writing? Honestly, I think it's something that I did from a very young age. It was definitely encouraged in my primary school, my secondary school. I had a wonderful teacher called Dr. Atherton who really encouraged my work. I think the main thing for me that really put me on a professional course as a poet was winning a competition called the Foyle Young Poets of the Year Award when I was about 16 years old. And it runs every year. It's for 11 to 17-year-olds. And the winners are selected by some quite eminent poets as judges to go on a residential course where we had workshops and, got to share feedback on our work with peers our own age writing poetry, and I hadn't really met anyone like that before. So that was really transformational for me and really encouraged me to believe in my own work and see myself as a poet going forwards. In terms of what inspired me to start writing, I'm not sure I could give you a sort of origin point, but something that I like to think about in general is poetry as a way of kind of understanding the world, of drawing connections between things in the world. And the world, especially now, can often feel kind of formless and chaotic and illogical and irrational. And obviously it is. But I find a lot of personally comfort and enjoyment in trying to draw these connections and find ways to make ideas and places and things and people kind of relate to each other in poetry. And this is something that I wrote actually for a commission from Poetry on Loan about that, a kind of statement of something that I try to do in my poetry. Equal to. Daffodils dilate to a varying extent. Hearts contract comparably without human intent. A flock of birds finding a describable formation can make its methods known through the most dulling medication. Inasmuch as the world is wider than two eyes can cover, I believe in seeing one thing inside another. Historically, this habit's been a cause for caution, the taxidermist smoothing lives into their just proportion. But ultimately, I feel less alone to know the world's connected by comparisons. That's not to say we'll ever find a true relation of things by putting them in conversation. All I know is something in me isn't so astray when you say the sky is a blanket, the sun is a flashlight, the lake is an ashtray. So the next question, what has it meant to you to be Birmingham Poet Laureate? Well, I think it's, among other things, it's really helped me get to know my city better. I lived for a few years in the Jewellery Quarter, and then for a couple of years in Selly Park in South Birmingham. And through the Laureate role, I really got to find out a lot more about different institutions and organisations across the city, spaces and bodies that are kind of promoting an understanding of the unique and varied heritage of Birmingham and the different things that are going on across the city. And something I really liked about the role and that I really wanted to pursue in the role was finding out what was important to people across the city, different projects, different histories. And I think I'll read a couple of poems that just show you some of the range of things that I've been kind of, or become interested in through this role as Laureate. So first I'm going to read something that I wrote for, I'm going to read something I wrote in my first kind of period of Laureate-specific writing, which is a period of residency on the 20th floor of the Rotunda. It was provided by Staying Cool, who run the apartments in the building. That was a really special thing to be able to do. And the idea really was kind of look down on the skyline and sort of understand the city through that. And this is a a poem that kind of tries to take a broad view of sort of the founding of the city and the history of the city, that was written during my time in this space, kind of looking over the whole skyline. Biorma. This is as good a place as any. Our beer-headed chief, fording the trickling river, thumped down a stake. Thick forest and thin soil. We scraped out dwellings, built a dike, a gate, raised cows and killed them. Salt for stubborn winters dragged us through, more above ground than not. Life, death, and then a better life. The glitter under the torn back earth. The streets spreading like roots, like heated iron. Something sharp and gathering. The winds of tracks, the steam erupting forth, careening into neon, glass. As good a place as any. And where that poem ends, the sort of neon glass modern city, that's kind of an aspect of Birmingham that we're most familiar with. But something I've really come to appreciate over the last few years is actually how green a city it is and how much nature and wildlife there is all around us. And this is a poem that I wrote responding more to that side of the city. It came out of a day spent with Birmingham Trees for Life, a really great charity that plants trees all across the city, particularly in areas that aren't so green, and engages with the urban histories that have led to some areas being more built up and having less green space, and tries to kind of push the needle the other direction a little bit. So this is a poem that came out of spending a day planting trees with Birmingham Trees for Life, and the variety of different people they got involved in the planting project. And a lot of this is kind of drawn directly from conversations I had on the day. We need all the trees we can get. After some training, even I can carve a perfect New York pizza slice of turf. But underneath this thin green strip, there's levels of resistance. See Chris switch, one earphone in, a podcast, MMA. From spade to fork, mattock to wrecking bar, and plunge and plunge and plunge into the shallow store of rubble. Sometimes there's more brick than soil, somebody says. You want more soil than brick. And Chris, who graciously explained what sets apart a shovel from a spade, I'm just here to dig holes, don't get involved in any politics. The grass on turf put back the wrong way up, competing with the new root ball for water, while a lady from the bank takes black bags home to plant courgettes. A quieter second life, having already yielded to the Riley Birch estate, their load of liquid amber. Walking back to the car, we pass a stand of beech and ash trees that long since outgrew the school children whose job was treading flat the earth around them 10 years earlier. The next question kind of bridges on from that, actually. How have you been able to make contact with ordinary people who wouldn't normally hear or read much poetry? Well, certainly one of the things that was important to me in this role was thinking about the role of poetry in public life. And poetry isn't necessarily always welcome in public life, and that's absolutely fine. It's always been, to some extent, more of a kind of specialist activity. I think that's how Simon Armitage, the National Laureate, tends to talk about it. But I think there are often times when people turn to poetry to commemorate things that are important to them, to explore emotions that kind of go maybe beyond the scope of the everyday, and weddings and funerals being the main kind of examples that I think a lot of people would think of for that. And so when I've been asked to write poems for organizations that are working with particular communities, the main thing for me really has just been trying to think about what the people who are going to hear this poem find interesting about its subject. So I did quite a few poems relating to histories in the Jewellery Quarter through the Jewellery Quarter Development Trust and their heritage projects, and also with the Hive in Argent College on Victoria Street. And in both cases, there were a lot of kind of archival interviews that I read over in the display boards in the Hive heritage space, and from the oral history project that the Jewellery Quarter Development Trust had kind of collected from interviews with people who'd worked in the jewellery trade over the last sort of 50 years. And with the poems that I produced coming out of this, I didn't want to put myself in the place of the subjects of the poems entirely, but I did want to speak in the first person because I kind of wanted to bring these stories to life and sort of inhabit them a little bit in terms that from the interviews I read, from the display boards I read, it felt like the subjects might recognize. And so I'm just going to read two poems that came out of those commissions. So this is, first of all, this is called Mossop Memory Museum, and this comes out of an oral history interview I read with a master brooch maker called Rod Mossop. And I was lucky enough to meet him at the photography exhibition Still, which took place at the one of the newer galleries in the Jewellery Quarter. And we discussed, what I'd taken from his interview, and it was really interesting comparing kind of my account of his experiences with his memories. And this poem has been edited a couple of times in response to Rod's comment on the actual kind of mechanical processes. Mossop Memory Museum. Some see their lives go gleaming past, a movie being shown. Me, I know my memory is a cast in cuttlebone. Saw an old chap gilding in a young enamel bowl. Felt how blue impressions settle deep into the soul. 55, the sandpit graves, the villas, cobbled streets. Watch the sculptor hover on the bone's blank sheet. Phoned up Alabaster where they made the signet rings. Charlie cast in cuttlefish. Alf was burnishing, so half the workshop smelt like beer, the other half like teeth. Lignum vitae sticks around. Other things are brief. Old Sid Wright, deaf as a peg, eyes sharp as his homemade drill. Tommy Evans, dead at the back, and me with his chasing tools. Dolly did the polishing. Arthur would only lap. Sometimes there's no second chance. Not everything has scrap. Bilious Paget cracks his neck. His hands can't close on a beer. Some of them have done this work for 57 years. Things I've made might last a person twice as long as that. I've got family in the trade 6 generations back. Draw the border, carve the air vents, leave a space for sprue. Don't forget to brush away the residue. Poor Frank Harris did the cufflinks. Died young. Never good. I punched a master maker's mark on everything I could. M and a rod through an arrowhead. These things I made my own. My memories are cast in cuttlebone. So that's a poem where, it's very tightly rhymed. It's quite rhythmic. I'm thinking there, I guess, about poetry as its own kind of making and trying to kind of honor to some extent the effort and the skill that goes into what someone like Rod Mossop would have done by creating a poem that also has, elements of kind of craft and structure. I'm just going to read another poem that came out of that same commission for the Still photography exhibition, which is called Links in a Chain, and it's looking at the experience of some of the women in the jewelry trade. I think historically it's easy to kind of tell the story of work in that sector as being quite masculine, and of course there were actually lots of women involved in that history as well, and the exhibition did a good job of showing that. So I wanted to make sure that of the two poems I had to be displayed in the exhibition, there was that perspective was also represented. So this is called Links in a Chain. Before anyone else, you went through Olive, bridge between office and shop, communicating the way that metal does. Christine to Howell, Newell to Pauline, filtering dross, smoothing the edge of a job. From Olive, work passed on through women's hands to women's fingers. Underneath it all, the way that music does, Mrs. Ty kept score, a choreography of hearts and boxes, like in an old movie, which wasn't old back then, and nor was she. Before Hazel had kids, had CSEs, before, the way that time does, Steve and Shirley danced across a polished floor, my brooch a red they can't make anymore. So as with the Mossop poem, there are quite a lot of really hyper-specific references there to things that came up in the oral histories, names and craft practices that really specifically mattered to the people involved. And I think one answer to that question about kind of reaching ordinary people with poetry is you're not always trying to reach everyone at the same time. These were poems written for specific audiences that would have memories of specific names and practices. And I think I went about these commissions really with that specificity in mind. So if you worked in the jewelry trade and you came to the event where you heard this poem, it would mean something to you specifically, even if it wouldn't be as kind of lucid for anyone else. I'm just going to finish, I think, with another poem that came out of a commission in the Jewellery Quarter at the Hive space, which I mentioned earlier, which is now a college, Argent College. But that building was a factory that was subdivided into lots of different workshops, and so has lots of different histories, different meanings for the people who worked there. And so this is trying to bring together a lot of different perspectives of people who use the space for different reasons. And it's meant to be a kind of whistle-stop tour of lots of different things. And because it felt so comprehensive when I read about what went on there, I wrote an Abacidarian, which sounds quite alarming, but it's just a poem where the lines each start with the next letter of the alphabet, A, then B, then C, and that's the structure of the poem. And I'm just going to finish up with this. An Abacidarian for Argent College. All of it here, coming out of the ground, off the presses. Beads underfoot, bangles, bread studded with herbs, culled fresh from the rooftop farm, candles and car parts, diamonds, Birmingham, enough to see the telegram reaches its spot. Edward Moses Levitus setting up shop, electroplating anything he could find. Frank Blankensee cooking up Canadian gold, and Graham upstairs turning feathers into gilded leaves. How the whole thing turns on the hand, the head, and the heart. Industry seed in the bison drawn in a cave, its horns jewellery before this city lifted a loop. Old machines juddering, jangling, this is kinetic, this is the fount of wedding rings and crumpled wrappers, leather table mats and stud boxes, and Lovekin suing his factory mate for a slice of the silver pie. A muddle of making. Necklaces threaded with toothpastey copper medallions, next to Oraton bangles, cream pots, an organic lunch every day, picked straight from the sky, wet felt phone cases. Up on the roof, plastic buckets resemble those made here from iron. Quests for the new quite often return to the source. So many pass through this place. So many remain, soldering, sewing, tying back their hair, their nails chipped, scrubbing the walls until what history hid comes off in their hands, until, very slowly, with the requisite care, something is revealed, which Lovekin, Edward, and Frank might recognise. An X-ray through to the bones and knuckles of craft. Years falling away as the bricks emerge from the dirt, as a spark zooms out of a furnace, a sleeper stretches and starts.